Hello BookTube, it's Leah Cooper here, and today I'm bringing you sort of a review, more of a discussion of The Tethered Mage by Melissa Caruso. Now, I received an ARC copy of this book through NetGalley in exchange for an honest review. And I haven't been a part of NetGalley for very long. I haven't done a whole lot of these ARC reads, but up until this point I have finished everything that I've requested from NetGalley. But The Tethered Mage presented me with some frustrations, and I will tell you up front that I DNF'd this book. It's the first book I DNF'd this year, and since I DNF'd it, I haven't rated it on Goodreads. I'm not going to rate it on Goodreads. Generally speaking, I probably wouldn't even do a review, but since this is an ARC and I received an ARC copy of it for a review, I sort of feel like I need to do a review. And also, this book, while I didn't care for it, and I don't like it, and I can't recommend it, did make me think about two primary issues, and that's what I kind of want to discuss in this review mostly. And that's kind of why this is more of a discussion, and those are how to choose the protagonist for your novel, and incorporating slavery elements into your fantasy world building. The Tethered Mage is an upcoming fantasy novel, and I requested it for review, one, because it's being published by Orbit, which is a publisher who has done a few books recently that I've enjoyed, namely N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series. And then secondly, the blurb made it sound like a book in the similar vein to, again, N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series, and I thought, you know what, this might be interesting. And I think the blurb is really important here because it's incredibly misleading in one key way. And I want to read it to you. In the Riveran Empire, magic is scarce and those born with power are strictly controlled, taken as children and conscripted into the Falcon army. Theyre has lived her life on the streets to avoid this fate, hiding her mage mark and thieving to survive. But hers is a rare and dangerous magic, one that threatens the entire empire. Second paragraph. Lady Amalia Cornaro was never meant to be a falconer. Heiress and scholar, she was born into a treacherous world of political machinations. But fate has bound the heir and the mage, and as war looms on the horizon, a single spark could turn their city into a pyre. From that blurb, I think it's not crazy to assume that this would be a dual perspective narrative, giving us both Theyre and Amalia, and these two conflicting worldviews. Since the opening two paragraphs are about, first, what happens to mages in a society, and then B, the mage character, and how the mage character has had a rough life up until this point, I think it's not crazy to assume that the preponderance of the book would be about that character. Also, the fact that the title is The Tethered Mage, right? All of these things are hints to the reader to suggest that we're going to get the mage's perspective. The book is primarily about this mage. Even if it is a dual narrative between the mage and the heiress, the mage is still mentioned first. And that's not the case at all. Entirely, as far as I can tell. I mean, I only read 33% of the book, but the way it was written up until that 33% mark, it seems very clear that that is the way the rest of the book was going to be written. We weren't going to have a sudden narrative shift. The book is entirely written in first-person perspective, from the perspective of Amalia, the heiress. And that is the root of most of this book's problems, though not all of them. At its core, this book is dealing with, hesitate to call it a fantasy land because it really isn't an original world. It is really a copy and paste of the Republic of Venice, which I could go into of why would you even bother making it a fantasy land? Why not just make it an alternative Venice since nothing's really changed except for the magic, but whatever. But it's a fantasy land, Rivera, with an extremely strong slavery system in it. And I think inherently slavery is a touchy subject in a book, no matter if it's fantasy or science fiction or historical or whatever. It's a delicate topic. And I think any author who approaches slavery as a crux of their world building and their plot needs to be extremely thoughtful about how they approach that topic, and needs to be an incredibly agile and nuanced author. While the first chapter of this book was interesting, it became extremely clear very quickly that I couldn't trust this author to be thoughtful or nuanced on this topic or about this topic. There are a lot of elements in this story that are just kind of tropey, typical of the genre, but what really frustrated me over and over again is the lack of care that the author gave to dealing with this issue of slavery in her world. I think I need to talk about the characters a little bit so that you can understand this and why this irritates me, and then I'm going to seg into a discussion of choosing your protagonist, right? So we've got these two supposedly primary characters. In reality, we only have one protagonist, and that is Amalia. She is the heir to almost the most powerful person in this empire. Theoretically, there is a man who is elected by the Council of Nobility in Rivera, aka Venice, and he is the leader of the empire. But really, her mother, the Contessa, holds way more keys to power. Amalia has a fairly decent, positive relationship with her extremely powerful mother, and she's being groomed to take her mother's place, not just as a nobleman, but also to take on the reins of power that her mother possesses. So Amalia, our protagonist, is a rich, well-educated, hyper-privileged person in this society who happens to be a bookworm, who happens to, dress like a man, who doesn't want to dress like other women, who doesn't like political machinations, but recognizes that she needs to be able to navigate those waters because of her position in society and her mother's expectations and her desire to, to some degree live up to some of her mother's expectations. And again, it's a pretty positive relationship. There is nothing inherently in Amalia that wants to break down the social privilege she possesses. Neither is there any real acknowledgement of just how much social privilege she possesses. Then we have our secondary character, theyre. Again, extremely stereotypical, orphan, lived on the streets, has this magical ability, has been hiding it because in the society, if you have a magical ability, you will be taken and enslaved by the Empire and forced to fight for them. Again, I think I need to explain the way this subjugation of magic users in the society works. There's this bracelet, which is like kind of steampunky technology. In this book, it's called artificing, which makes me think of Star Wars: The Old Republic, but I digress. So there are these bracelets, and a non-magic user, a falconer, will put the bracelet on a magic user, thereby binding themselves and the magic user together and completely subjugating the magic user's ability to use their magic at all to the will of the person who bound them. So once the gest is on their wrist, they can't do magic at all until the person who controls them, effectively their slave owner, says a magic word that unlocks their ability. And then their slave owner can then say another magic word to completely shut it off. Through the beginning of the narrative, the author tries to shove down this idea that it's a partnership, but it's such an egregious disparity in power and control that it's not a partnership. There's no possibility for a partnership to exist in such a power imbalance. It's a slavery system. It's a complete slavery system. And it's compounded even more by the fact that these magic users are unilaterally inscripted into the army for the Empire. And this is the root of all of my issues with this book. We are presented with a society, we are given a slave character and a slave owner effectively, because Amalia obviously puts a jest on theyre, thereby becoming her falconer and enslaving her to the whim of the Empire. And it's told, we are always in Amalia's head. So the author is expecting the reader to sympathize or to empathize or to identify with a slave owner, which I think is, for me as a reader, that's just not going to happen. I can't. And the only reason I really thought this book might be something I'd be interested in reading is when I read the blurb, and from the blurb thought, oh, this is going to be from the perspective of the Tethered Mage, the eponymous Tethered Mage, theyre, the character who most of the blurb is written about. Asking me to empathize with a slave owner character, especially one who at no point really confronts her own social privilege, is a no-go for me. But I kept trying to push through this book, despite my reservations about it, despite the fact that I didn't trust this author to be really nuanced about these topics. And I just repeatedly, every time I would go to update my progress in Goodreads, I would be so irritated by what was happening in the book. That ultimately led to my decision to DNF it, because it was such a vile experience to read it that I couldn't do it anymore. And why was it an irritating experience? It really comes down to this authorial expectation for me to empathize with Amalia. That's not just because she's the protagonist. She's also very obviously written to be a sympathetic character. Repeatedly, we get her inner monologuing about how this has affected her life. What a great thing she has done by putting a Jess on this girl, by enslaving theyre, because theyre was a threat to the Empire, because theyre can't control herself. Repeatedly, over and over again, the protagonist remarks on how she's underappreciated, despite the fact that she did this thing to save the city. There are repeated subtle appeals to the reader to empathize with her. And that's just not going to happen. It's a slavery system. She enslaved this girl. And what's more is she repeatedly tries to justify it. And it's not like a justification where you can tell that the character knows what she's saying is wrong and she's trying to convince herself that the system that she has grown up in is right. It really felt more like the author was trying to convince us of these reasons that the character was giving. Like, theyre is too dangerous to be allowed freedom. She can't control herself without these external controls, because that's just in her nature. It's in her nature to be uncontrollable, so she has to be controlled. It's not really slavery. You've just been conscripted to the army. And that was infuriating, because that excuse was used repeatedly with sort of this complete denial or complete obliviousness to the fact that, historically speaking, empires have never had any qualms taking enslaved people and forcing them to fight for them in their army. That is, in fact, something we see repeated throughout history when it comes to empires and slavery. And I didn't finish the book, so who knows? Maybe in the last 0.25%, the author turns it all around and forces her protagonist to confront her privilege and etc., etc. It was so off-putting. The character, the privileged, not like other girls, rich-ass character whose idea of buying a gift for the girl she's just enslaved is to buy her a necklace. Like, just what? The secondary love interest, who's supposedly the leader of the Falcons, or like the second in command of the Falcons, just repeatedly, everything that happens to theyre somehow becomes an opportunity to ask how Amalia is doing, with just, like, no regard for theyre as a person, as a human being, as a sentient creature, other than as a tool. And this is going to I'm going to seg first into my discussion of slavery in fantasy worlds. When it works for me and when it doesn't, because this really made me stop and think, because there's a couple key books with slavery elements in them that I have loved. One of those, great example, being The Broken Earth. And because of the structure of both these fantasy societies, I think this comparison is an apt one, because the relationship between the Falcon and the Falconers, and the relationship between the Guardians and the Origines in The Broken Earth is identical. Like, structurally, dynamically is identical. Obviously, they have different root mythologies informing these novels that are vastly different, but the dynamics are the same. So why was it that I loved one of these books and could not get through the other one? I mean, part of it's the writing. More than that, it had to do with the fact that one of those books is from the perspective of the subjugated, and the other book is from the perspective of the subjugator. One of these books confronts the slavery issue. The other book repeatedly asks me to both empathize with the subjugator, but then buy the subjugator's bullshit. Like, do you see what I'm saying? Slavery, subjugation, power dynamics, social inequality, these are all things that should be examined in literature. But if you're going to tackle topics that resonate with real life shit, and it does, this topic does, you have to be real careful about how you approach that topic. Frankly, I don't think you can do this topic in a book without confronting the fact that it has really broad implications. Because even if we completely divorce it from real life, even if I completely ignore the fact that it, intentionally or not, is reflective of social issues we are still dealing with, the fact that we have a sole protagonist referring to another character as property. She calls her repeatedly my falcon, which made me want to gag every single time it happened. That we have the protagonist forcing another character to fight for an empire that treats her as property. I mean, like, that's just, that just makes the protagonist vile. And I personally am not into reading about vile protagonists that are written in such a way that I'm pretty sure the author doesn't get that her character is vile. Those are some of my thoughts. Again, I didn't finish reading this book, so maybe the author turns around and really examines the topics she brings up in her world building. I don't know. But nothing in the first third of the book led me to believe that she was going to. And that's why I just had to wash my hands of it. Because I'm not interested in reading this kind of narrative, this very flat, unexamined, unnuanced, unchallenging, weirdly privileged narrative. There's been a lot of controversy around BookTube and a lot of debate about whether or not you should rate and review books you haven't read or you didn't finish. So I'm going to pop in a couple of my thoughts on this topic just here at the end. I don't think you have to read a book to have an opinion on whether or not you want to read that book. That's like circular reasoning. Some people do not care about reading reviews to make decisions on what book they want to read. They're just going to make decisions. There are other people, though, who read reviews because they want to make really informed decisions about what they want to read. And there's nothing wrong with that. The point of a review is to provide information for a book so that those readers can make informed decisions about whether or not to invest time in reading that book. And that is a perfectly valid way of deciding whether or not you want to read something. If you read reviews and they discuss things or they point out things that turn you off from a book and you say, you know what, I don't want to read that book, that is a totally valid response. Like, that is totally a valid way of making a decision. Okay, let's talk about reviewing books you haven't read. I think this is a complex issue, and I think you have to approach it with some nuance. I don't think you can just like lay down a black and white answer here. If you haven't read a book at all, should you be reviewing it on Goodreads? Probably not. However, if you've attempted a book, then a review of your reactions to what you read is just that. It's a written or spoken account of your reactions to what you read. That's valid as well. Should you lie and say and lead someone to believe that you've read the entire book when you haven't? No, I think you should be upfront about, this is how much of it I've read, or this is how much of it I consumed, and these are my thoughts from consuming that much. So that, again, the reader can make an informed decision based on, well, this is how much they did or did not finish, or they did or did not get to the end. Now, obviously, a review of a partial read is never going to be as complete as a review of having read the entire work. That's the caveat I include to this review/discussion. I didn't get to the end, but I still think it's important to make this review, to talk about it, because this book did inspire me to really think about some topics, which I have now discussed. For anyone who would have the same objections that I had reading it, you know, this might be helpful to steer someone away from a similarly frustrating, time-wasting experience as I had. And so that's all this review is intended for. I think there's a lot of unexamined privilege in this book that was just cringy, in my opinion. In my head, I was imagining this would be a very different book than what it turned out to be. I definitely will not be coming back to it. I won't be reading any more books in the series. Sorry, not sorry. Let me know if this review has been helpful, or if you want to chat about any of the topics I brought up here in the comments down below. If you enjoyed my reviews or any of my other content. I swear I don't always give negative reviews. I've just had not great luck with ARCs recently. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.